couple more people popping in. Hello and welcome to our baking session this afternoon. We are just getting started with our vegan flourless chocolate torte. You can call it a cake. You can really call it whatever you would like. We have our oven set to 350 degrees. I'm actually not using an 8 by 8 inch square pan, which is what it says down later on in step 4 to pour your batter into an 8-inch square pan or Pyrex dish. I don't have one of those. My Pyrex is one of the big casseroles, so I'm going to be using a round springform pan. That means that I can remove the sides very easily, which helps with this recipe because sometimes it can get a little bit crumbly, and this way I can just kind of keep it all in its position and then present it as one full torte. But the delicious thing about this recipe is you can make it in any pan and it's going to taste really, really great. It's just sort of about how you want to present it. You can make it in little cake pans, little tart pans. You can make it in a regular cake pan and then just slice it and serve it. There's a lot of different ways. It's just the glass baking dish is a nice even heating, and then you can cut out squares, which is kind of nice for the final product. You'll see is not exactly like a cake, but it's a little bit flatter. It will fall in the middle, so don't think that you did anything terribly wrong if your sink's a little bit, just because the only leavening agents we have going for us are baking soda and the chemical reaction that has with the vinegar. Which is a fun science experiment as well as a delicious recipe. So we're just gonna try to use this hour as a way to de-stress and relax and treat ourselves to something delicious, and then go right back to the news and the ways of the world right now. But thank you for being here. I know there's a lot of stuff going on, so I'm happy we can take this time together to just not forget it, but maybe take a break for a minute. So we're going to just mix everything all in one bowl basically, and then pour it into our pan and then right into the oven. So 350, make sure you turn your oven on now if you're going to be baking along with me. And the next most important part of the recipe, if you read through it, is sifting. In our step 2, we want to sift the flour, sugar, cocoa powder, baking soda, and salt. All of our dry ingredients are going to mix together in the bowl first, and then we're going to combine our wet, barely mix them together. The more we mix it, the denser it's going to be. We want to make sure that any air we're putting into this cake stays in the cake. So that actually happens in the sifting process as well, which is why sifting is really important here. The finer and more separate that you can get all of those dry particles, then the more likely you're going to have a fluffier product in the end. So I'm using a gluten-free baking mix to keep this entire thing like an alternative cake, flour, gluten-free, and vegan. Bob's Red Mill brand makes a really great one-to-one exchange gluten-free mix. This is what I'm using here. There's also a brand called Cup for Cup, which is a really great alternative gluten-free baking mix. It just comes pre-mixed. It's a good ratio of rice flours, potato starch, and let's see, this has a little bit of brown rice flour also, and the sorghum, which is a really important thing. Since it doesn't have gluten in it, the sorghum kind of helps cover for the gluten when you're making certain things. Yeah, you can definitely use regular flour. Good question. It's going to be a little bit cakier. You're going to have a little bit more of a rise to it, but not much. You're going to have it'll be good. Definitely you can use regular flour if you don't have a gluten-free mix and don't want to buy anything special. That's perfectly fine. That's sort of the whole point of some of these cup for cup exchange mixes that are made. You can interchange this mix for any recipe that calls for AP flour. Like a cup of that AP flour would be a cup of this, and vice versa. So that's sort of the general idea when they make these, which is why I recommend buying the blend already made. So we're going for 1.5 cups of our flour blend, whichever flour you're going to end up using. You want to make sure that it's pretty level. You're not going with a very over 1 cup here. Yeah, that's good. 1 cup. So I'm going to pour, I have a very old-timey hand sifter here. If you have a different kind, that's great. If you have a big enough one where you can put your flour, cocoa, and baking soda all into it at the same time, then I recommend doing that. Sifting it together actually helps you start mixing, which is great to have a head start, and it kind of it just incorporates it really, really well in like a fine ground way. So if you can sift your flour and cocoa and things together, then I recommend doing so. I'm going to try to get as much dry goods into this little sifter that I have as possible, but I might have to do it in a couple batches. That's all right. Like a little hand thing, you just kind of crank it here and it goes through, pass down through the family. All right, I'm going to have 1 cup of sugar. You can definitely use like you could substitute coconut sugar if you like it or have it, but just regular sugar is fine. 1 cup of that. You just kind of sift as you mix, and then it kind of all sifts together as it goes down through the sifter. Our next one is cocoa powder. Again, you want to make sure that you got unsweetened cocoa and you're not using like a hot chocolate mix or something. That is going to add way too much extra sugar into your cake here. So we want 1/2 cup of cocoa. I've got classic Hershey's unsweetened. I really actually like their flavor. Hershey's doesn't make necessarily the best chocolate, but I like their cocoa powder. That's a personal thing. 1/2 cup of cocoa. That's where all of the chocolate and flavor is coming from. So if you skimp out on some other ingredients in your baking, but then maybe get the good cocoa, that's a good idea. Maybe depends on what you're making, but if it's the main ingredient or main flavor source, then I recommend just make sure it's not expired. That can actually be a thing. So there's a tip on that. So we need our baking soda and our salt. And I'm using regular, small, like fine table salt for this. If you have fine sea salt, that's fine, just not big chunky salt. So we want 1 teaspoon of the baking soda. And then it is 1/2 teaspoon of salt. And these are very important that you measure that correctly. The baking soda, that's the fun part about this to me. It's sodium bicarbonate, which is the chemical property. That's what baking soda is. When it reacts with the vinegar, sodium bicarbonate is a base and the vinegar is an acid. When they react together, different things can happen depending on the ratio of the chemicals that you use. It's what you use to make the like elementary school volcanoes explode. And in this sense, it's going to combine inside of our cake to give it a lift because we don't have any eggs or milk or other liquids in there that would be doing that for us. So sifted is done. I'm going to set this aside. If you do have an old-fashioned sifter like me, don't soak it in water. Run it through the water and clean it as you're cleaning it, but then try to dry it off as well as you can. But don't let it soak. Those parts inside can get a little rusty and then they're impossible to clean. Just a tip. So you've got your dry ingredients all measured out. If you couldn't sift them all at once like me, because your sifter is small, then you do want to give it a little bit of a toss together at this point, because we're not going to be mixing it very much once we get our liquids in here. We want to really be gentle with the mixing process. So the more you get a well-combined dry base here, then the less we're going to have to mix when we get our liquids added to the process. It's like a lot of our other things we've done. If you overmix this, you're going to make a very dense product. We're not going to have any kind of a good rise or a nice friendly chemical reaction, and so then you're going to have just like kind of a very thin sheet of chocolate, but it won't be very fun to eat. So let's see. Okay, dry goods set aside just for a bit right here. I'm going to be very glad the lid was on that. That would have been an expensive mess. Vanilla is not cheap. So I'm going to be doing it in 2 different measuring cups just so I can measure it all and then add the cold water to it and get all of my wet ingredients mixed together in one measurer, and then it's going to be added all in one go, just again to protect from any overmixing that might occur. Want to be really careful with that. So I've got plain canola oil if you have a vegetable, or I guess a peanut or a safflower would work too. Just a very neutral, low-level oil. Canola and vegetable have good fats. They're good for us, so try to stick with those and then, well, so does peanut and safflower. There's just various levels, whatever's good for your diet, whatever you like, whatever you keep in your pantry, I suppose. Just not an olive oil. In that situation, it would be way too heavy. It would make the cake dense again. So we want 1/3 of a cup of canola oil. To make sure I can see that, I'm using a very old measuring cup. There we go. 1/3 of a cup, a teaspoon of vanilla. It's interesting that vanilla is always an ingredient in chocolate cakes and brownies and things that end up tasting nothing like vanilla. They taste like chocolate. But this natural kind of sweetening agent and flavoring agent brings out so much of that sweetness and natural richness in chocolate that it actually, it would taste less chocolatey if it didn't have the vanilla, which is kind of a beautiful thing. They need each other. So we've got 1 teaspoon. The vinegar, our very important ingredient in this cake. As I was explaining, the chemical reaction is fun, but like you need this to happen or the cake's not going to work without a leavening agent like an egg or something. If you don't have regular distilled white vinegar, I wouldn't use white wine vinegar. That's not quite the same thing. That's from different kinds of grapes. If you don't have regular white distilled, then apple cider would work just as well. So 1 full teaspoon of that white vinegar. Make sure I get every last drop. Make sure I put the cap back on that vanilla in case anything happens. All right. And then we need 1 cup of cold water. So if you have water that comes out of the door of your fridge, or like I have a Brita in here, so I'm just going to get that. 1 cup of very cold water. Little spout. The temperature of this is important, I think, because of the chemical reaction, and also it just, well, it keeps this nice and together, honestly. Like you've got that kind of mixed together that's not going to emulsify, but it's also, it's not going to separate really, well, definitely separated, but it's hard to put into words what I'm trying to say. The cold water helps this blend kind of keep the oil from getting like really, really runny. It actually kind of like helps keep it as solid as it would be in its oil liquid state. I don't know how to say that. So then, okay, important part, create like a little well in the center of your dry ingredients. That's where we're gonna pour in all of our wet ingredients. And then we're going to mix them very carefully, not too much, starting from the bottom and kind of folding over itself into the center. You just want to get it just mixed. And so by going around the sides and the bottom to start with, you're making sure that no big chunks are going to just like stay down there and stick to the bottom or stick to the sides. This process also doesn't really like compress the flour and the liquids. You want to just kind of gently fold them and mix them. You don't want to like beat down any of the air that could exist in there. So you just want to gently fold, slowly mixing like through the center and then back to the sides. As soon as you can see there's no like really, really big clumps of dry flour, it's very easy to fix those. You just kind of like mix them in, but some lumps are okay. They'll cook out mostly. Just no really big sections of dry flour that you can tell has not been at least touched a little bit by some of the liquid. So you should have a pretty good wet, loose batter. You want to make sure you get all of it. I'm going to scrape that all off here. If I were cooking for anybody else and you had your nails on, you want to wear gloves. Nail polish chips easily into your food, just as a side note, if you are cooking for a lot of other people. Or just wash your hands really well and make sure. But there we go. So I'm not greasing the pan. I'm not doing anything to it. It doesn't need it. If we added a grease to the pan, it would actually, the sides of the cake wouldn't really have anything to grab onto as it tries to crawl up the sides. It would just kind of slide down. So it actually works its way up the sides by gripping onto it a little bit, if that makes sense. And so you don't want a pan spray to stop it from doing that. I'm cooking it on this pan just because it's going to make it easier for me to get it in and out of the oven. So it's just on a sheet pan for ease of use at this point, so I don't have to try to grab this little pan later on. And I'm going to pour all the batter in there. This is a 9-inch round, which is basically the same as an 8-inch square. The 8-inch, if we use an 8-inch round, you would actually be missing space from the 8-inch square just because you don't have the corners. So go up to a 9-inch round, and then you have pretty much the same amount of volume inside that cake pan. So I'm using a 9-inch spring form here, and it goes in very nicely. You don't have to worry about spreading it out too much. It does that for itself, but you can just give it a little jiggle, and that'll kind of settle it out. And then this goes into the oven. That's as easy as that. It's one of the simplest things in concept, as long as you are attentive to the ideas of sifting and not over mixing. Those are really the key things to pay attention to in this recipe. So it's going to go in for about 25 to 30 minutes, depending on the size of the pan that you're using. I'm going to check mine in 15 because the oven is uneven. We've talked about this before. If you've been in these classes with me, then most ovens are not calibrated perfectly. They're very uneven. One side is hotter than the other. The front is almost always hotter than the back. So you deal with that by turning what you're cooking around like 180 degrees in the middle of the cooking process. That goes a long way. Oh, that was exactly what I had left in that bag. Perfect. So this is the real simple part. You can garnish this with a lot of different things. I just use powdered sugar usually. This is just regular powdered sugar though, so you would have to wait until the cake is completely cooled off, or else it just absorbs right into the top, and then you get a very sweet and delicious, but a wet cake top. What we're looking for with this cake is actually a very dried out cake. The torte is going to look, you know, like brownies start to crack and crackle a little bit on the top when they're just done. That's what we're going for. Not severe cracking or deep cracking, but a little bit of a crackle in the top to show that the top has dried out. That we are actually looking for that. And so once we get that kind of nice dried out top though, the sugar would just soak into it. So you have to let it cool, and then the sugar doesn't absorb, and you get that nice, really beautiful like white dusting effect. Although there is a product called, I think it's just called non-absorbing powdered sugar or non-absorbing confectioner sugar, something like that, which has something in it, an additive or something, a different kind of sugar, maybe something that doesn't dissolve right away when it's on an object, and that's what they coat those powdered donuts in to get the sugar to stick but then not disappear. Like that's how that works. So I don't have that, and you don't need to have that just for decorating cakes. It's kind of nice, but you just let your cake cool down and then you dust it with some powdered sugar. It also goes incredibly well with berries or berry sauces. Chocolate is a good friend to raspberries especially, and strawberries, so you could always make a sauce or slice some berries and make a garnish out of that. But this is one of those really simple cakes. You can kind of put it in the oven, get everything cleaned up, and come back when the timer goes off. You can overcook it in the sense that the sides will get a little bit burned, like because of the cocoa, and it can get bitter, and it will be dry and overcooked. But even then, you can kind of cut around the edges, and it's not the worst thing that you could ever make in the world. But that range of just checking it between 20 and then maybe letting it go to 30 minutes, you're depending on your oven and the size of the pan. Again, that's the range that you're looking for. If you pull it at 20 minutes and there's serious jiggle going on, and you use a toothpick or maybe a very small skewer or sharp knife, if it comes out extremely wet, like wet batter, like what we just saw here, it's not done. But if it comes out, what you're looking for is actually some crumbs and stuff on the stick. I know that in a lot of baking, you want that toothpick to come out clean, and that tells you that it's done. That would tell us that this is overcooked, because it's going to carry over cooking a fair amount after we pull it out of the oven. So you want to pull it when that toothpick still has a little bit of like wet crumbs on it, but not raw batter. It's that middle point between raw batter and the toothpick is clean. We want that middle ground of, it's like 5 to 6 minutes away from being done. And that's when we pull it and put it up on our rack to let it start to cool, because it will continue the carryover baking process for a good amount of time. The consistency of the batter, it looked, oh, I'm sorry, you just missed that shot. It looked exactly like a regular cake batter does. Honestly, a little bit chunky, but it's very pourable, like a brownie batter or like a box mix chocolate cake. Just maybe a teeny bit thicker, but it was very, very similar to what you would find in like a brownie mix or something like that. Just a pourable batter, scraped it out and poured it into the pan. Good wet consistency, but you don't want to overmix that. So that is just one thing. Just kind of like gently stir it up with a spatula until all of your dried chunks and bits are mixed in, and then you're good to go. You want that on the middle rack in the oven, like most things that we bake. That gives it a nice even heat from top to bottom. If it were too close to the bottom, especially something like this that doesn't have a lot of air in it, the bottom would get real nice and crispy, and we don't want a super burnt bottom. Sounds funny. Anyway, so I've got my toothpicks, I've got my powdered sugar garnish ready to go, but that's going to happen later when it cools off. That is sort of this whole cake. We kind of just wait for it to finish baking at this point. So if there are any questions about anything else we're doing in the teaching kitchen or anything, any of our past baking workshops, if you are new, then we have been uploading the recordings as quickly as possible to our website, and so there are some backlog videos that you can catch up on and watch if you would like. We also now have a recipe catalog on our website, and I am working hard to get that updated as well as possible, but there are also lots of our old recipes now there, so you can actually access the recipe and watch the video, and hopefully it's all coming together, and you can still reach out to me with any questions or anything like that. But if you missed any of our earlier in the quarter classes and sessions, you can go back and try to do it for yourself and have fun with that. It's always a lot of fun. For me, I still watch like 30-year-old episodes of Julia Child on PBS, even if I've seen them 100 times. And sometimes I actually try to cook along with them because they're all on tape, or not tape, look, I'm dating myself. They're all available streaming. So you can press pause, cook a little, press pause, make sure you got all those instructions right, things like that. Kind of fun. But yeah, if anybody does have any questions about any past stuff, I'll be here. Next week is our last week, which is sad. This has been a really, really fun quarter. I've been really enjoying all of these workshops. Baking, especially baking, was my first love and passion and foyer into the kitchen. My first jobs were in bakeries. My grandma taught me to bake when I was 3. So this has been really, really fun to get to teach a little bit of what I know and have you guys along this fun journey of learning how to navigate the cooking from home process, which I know is a challenge for all of us. now that we're home a lot more. So as we start to get a little bit back to normal, or things are going to be a little up in the air this summer, hopefully we'll have some programming coming up, but next week will be our last week for now. And I'm going to send out a recipe for a quick French bread. So you will need yeast. If anyone has any trouble finding any yeast, please let me know. You might be able to try to, I don't know, figure something out. But, or I could find somewhere in your neighborhood that might have some wholesale, like a bakery. So reach out to me if you can't find any, but we're going to be making a yeast French bread next week to work on some dough principles. I think that making a good bread will be a good final project for this baking class. We started off with some pretty simple stuff, blueberry muffins and cookies, but learning those foundation recipes really gets you to where you can then feel comfortable looking at a bread recipe and saying to yourself, you know what, I can do this, I got this. So that's the plan for next week. Obviously, like we said, there's a lot going on in the world, and so I appreciate you being here today. It's just sort of a nice break before we get back to the world. Yeah. So this, just a few more minutes until this flips around, and then it's gonna just keep baking, really. And then when you're done with it, important to get it up onto a rack. Why I especially like using a spring form, those cheesecake pans if you have one, because you can quick release the sides while it cools, so that in the end it actually releases a little bit easier while it's still warm than it would while it was cold. While it's cold, it'll be kind of crusty around the sides, which is great. That's what we want, that kind of dried chocolate torte effect. But I want to get the sides off so I can present it as a whole tart, and so doing that while it's still just a little bit warm is easier. So, and then you keep your sides really nice and clean edged. At least that's the goal. Although I want to preface this cake to everybody that even the pros, there's nothing you can do about a flourless vegan cake getting a little bit rustic looking. It's gonna be rustic looking, I promise you. There's just, that's what happens when you don't have gluten to bind and stretch and become that kind of elasticity ingredient in the flour, and especially if you don't have butter or eggs to, well, also give it that fat, which combines things and gives it that nice cakey kind of consistency. You're not going to see this in this specifically. We tried to give it as much air as possible with those different methods, but this is going to be more like a rich, fudgy, delicious brownie cake thing. That's why it's called a torte, not a cake. This kind of torte thing, you slice it into little wedges if you can, or little squares, and serve it. It's very delicious and rich, even without all of the butter and eggs. At least I think so. I think the flavor is good. So don't be upset if and when it comes out of the oven and there's like crazy amount of cracks on top, or the side broke when you tried to take it out of your pan, or trying to slice into it, it just kind of turns into crumbly. Well, that might mean it's a little overdone, but the consistency of this is not going to treat you like cake normally treats you. So just be forewarned about that. But as long as you're expecting rustic, then you're going to be happy with what you get. That's sort of what I think. I like to tell myself it's artisan, and then you can charge lots more money for it. No joke, that's what restaurants do with words like that. That's how you can pay a lot more money for food, by just putting words like artisan and rustic and house made. I mean, where else would they be making it, right? It seems a little funny, but there you go. It's all in the words. So in terms of the French bread recipe for next week, there is nothing like weird. You don't have to go digging up any crazy buttermilks or things. It's just the yeast. So if you are going to participate next week, I hope you all do, then start looking now. If you don't have yeast, try to get yeast. And we're looking for active dry yeast. Let me find a little envelope. Active dry yeast is the what we're normally looking for. I think my phone is not working here. Oh, okay. Okay, sorry about that. I was getting a public safety alert message. I guess it doesn't film while that's happening. Didn't know that. Okay. Not instant yeast and not fresh yeast, which if you could find fresh yeast right now, that would be amazing. It comes in a brick form. You have to keep it in your refrigerator and it's fresh. It's like a paste almost, a little bit like a dry Play-Doh. But you want the powder. You just want regular, active, dry yeast, not instant, just active, original dry yeast. Any brand, obviously, is fine. What is the difference in yeast? Well, they just react differently. That's a really good question. So instant yeast starts to work right away, and you don't have to like let it feed with the sugar. So if you're using this just regular active yeast, you put that in a bowl. It has to have warm water to help activate it. And then you have to feed it with sugar. And that's why you put the salt in a little bit later, because salt will kill the yeast reaction. And any recipe that calls for this kind of yeast, then you have to kind of let it sit with the sugar and the water for just a few minutes usually, until it gets a little foamy and a little like stuff's happening, because this is a living thing, so you're kind of like bringing it back to life. Fresh yeast is already ready to go. It's very active. It's wet and pasty a little bit, kind of in brick form, and you use different measurements of it just because you don't have to activate it in the same kind of a way. And so you would use that in more commercial baking. That's used in different bakeries use that. Old bread recipes call for fresh yeast. Most baking these days has transitioned into the dry yeast, though, unless you work at like an old French place or a big commercial establishment, because then you can get the big fresh yeast in brick form. And then instant, it just, yeah, you don't have to wait for it to feed with the sugar. I think instant is really great for bread machines because you can kind of throw it all in there and then it just sort of starts by itself. You don't have to wait for the yeast to come alive a little bit. All right, so timer went off. That was just 15 minutes. I just want to check. I'm going to show you what's happening here. I'm not sure it's going to come out perfectly clearly in the phone camera, but you can see hopefully that around the sides, it is set up and starting to be dry. Like I got air pockets that popped, and it's like it looks like it's starting to be a finished cake, but in the middle it is just jiggly wet batter completely. So we need all of it to set up and start looking like a firm, dried out cake. So I'm going to spin that 180 degrees. Make sure that my front is now my back, and then reset for about 10 more minutes. And that is that. But that's a good question about the yeast. It's depending on what you need it for and how quickly you need the yeast to start working. In old croissant recipes, for example, we learned in school to make all of that with fresh yeast. But most recipes, as I was saying, have been transitioned into active dry. It's just more commonly found in our markets and in our bakeries, and so most recipes in the States use this for the instant, but you just need to be really clear that you've read the recipe carefully and that you buy one or the other, because if you try to use active dry in a recipe that called for instant, it's not going to work. If you used instant in an active dry, it might just be extra yeasty. It'll probably still work. I'd have to look that up. I haven't done that myself as an experiment or a accident, and so that's usually how I learn things, you know, how we all learn things, through mistakes. So I haven't messed that up yet. So I haven't learned that specific lesson, but I'm sure thousands of people have. So that'd be an interesting one to look up. But I can't see how that it would ruin the process of an instant yeast because it's ready to go. So yeah, I think that you'd be all right. It might just be maybe extra well-fed yeast at that point if you let it sit with the sugar and all that kind of good stuff. But there are little tricks. So if your recipe for a bread machine says specifically to put the sugar in the 10 o'clock corner and the salt in the 3 o'clock corner, then you really need to do that. Because if the salt mixes with the yeast too early in the recipe, it'll kill the growth process. Any of those live cultures that are starting to form, the salt can kill that if they introduce to each other too early in the process. I love baking, especially bread, because of that science aspect of it. It is a science. And luckily, other people have been figuring it out for thousands of years before us. Every single culture on the planet has a bread and has been making it long before we came along with our fancy machines and fancy flours and fancy yeasts and all of that. Usually it was made with wild yeast or eggs, different kinds of, or flatbreads are the most common in antiquity, really. But breads are great. And when we did figure out yeast, it was because of beer. And then we had the two best things, beer and bread. And lots of historians in the food history realm and anthropology and theorize that it is because of those things, beer and bread, although some debate which one was first, that created civilization. People started hanging out together more because of beer and bread. And I love that idea very, very much. So let me check if there were any other questions that popped up. No. Okay. Good question about the yeast, though. Really good. So if that sounds like something fun, I thought that would be a good way to finish off our term next week with some bread, because that to me is the epitome of baking skills. You can make really fine patisserie, and you can get into making French pastries, and I think that you should try to make some croissant dough someday. There's actually what they call short croissant dough. You can make a cheap version of it, so it takes way less time than a traditional croissant dough. But I recommend trying those things. But I just thought that with our last opportunity, getting into a little bit of kneading and making some bread and getting that action, then you can go out into the world and start comparing your sourdough to everybody else, I guess. Yeah, so that is that. And then coming up this week, tomorrow, we've got breakfast. I'm really excited. We're doing a diner blue plate special in which I get to talk about the nerd trivia of the blue plate special and where that term comes from, but also the sort of classic Americana. I'm kind of testing the skills that we've gotten so far in breakfast class. We're going to be doing some fried eggs, some French toast, some proteins, really your choice of protein, turkey, bacon, chicken sausage, whatever you want, and some fruit salad. So we've got a classic diner plate happening tomorrow, which is exciting for me. It's my favorite food. Kids workshop this week is family taco night on Wednesday. They'll be doing ground turkey tacos with all the fixings there, teaching the kids how to make you guys dinner, which is great. And then Thursday, I'm really looking forward to dinner Thursday night. We're making shrimp scampi, which you can always substitute chicken or even just a veg medley like mushrooms and zucchini if you're vegetarian. But the basic scampi medley of heavy on the garlic, heavy on the lemon, good amount of fresh parsley, quick stovetop method so that we don't have to turn our ovens on. I saw Wednesday, Thursday, it's supposed to be pretty warm. So fun week coming up this week for our penultimate week of spring quarter classes. And then next week, we've got a lot of fun stuff I'm looking down the pipe to do. Like I said, bread in this class. And then for breakfast, I want to do some really complicated stuff. We're going to go right back to culinary school and make our own poached eggs and hollandaise sauce for Eggs Benedict. And yeah, some other fun things happening next week. So if you're not already signed up for those workshops, make sure you check those out because it's the last few for now. And then we're looking into what we are going to start offering hopefully over the summer as we work towards what we're going to be offering hopefully over the fall. So I can't believe this quarter went by like it did, considering how the last 2 weeks of March was the longest year of my life. But here we are, and I'm excited. for a change in season. I'm excited for a change in the air. I'm excited for changes, hopefully. So, checking. Oh, I still had a little too much of a jiggle, and I'm getting very impatient. This is the point when you can't really do anything except wait for it to be finished, and it's torture, and you just want it to be done so you can show everyone and then eat it all right out of the pan. This is a really nice treat if you do have anybody in your life that is vegan. This is a lovely birthday cake or a special dessert for a holiday or a dinner. If you have anybody who has celiac, I'm sorry. And even a gluten intolerance can be very annoying. So if that's a part of your life, whether it's you or your family, then this is a great staple to have in your repertoire to make this. You can see how simple it is to get it in the oven, get your dishes done in the meantime, and then you're ready to kind of chill out with your dessert. You can make it in advance earlier that day. You can. They don't freeze very well. I wouldn't necessarily freeze this. You can keep it on the counter for maybe another day, as long as you wrap it up really tightly with some good plastic wrap. And to do that, if you've taken it out of the pan, or if your pan is kind of low and you think wrapping it in plastic might crush the top or stick to the top, then just put a couple toothpicks into the top, and that will help keep the plastic a little bit risen away from the surface of your cake, so it doesn't take off all of that nice, dry, crackly surface area that we are probably going to see a little bit of. And again, let's see any other tips or tricks. Yeah, if you wrap it up pretty tightly, it'll last on your counter for maybe a couple days, but that's if you don't eat it. How did these classes start? Well, when we get back to campus, that's a good question. The classes started pretty soon after we were quarantined and the campus was closed. We were looking for ways that we could still be a resource to the community. I started first by making pre-recorded videos, and then that transitioned finally once we all got Zoom ready, into these workshops. I think my first one was the weeknight meals Thursday night workshop on the first week of April, I want to say, April 8th or somewhere right in there. So we have been doing them for a little bit, and we do hope to have at least some programming over the summer. I'm not going to promise anything because everything in life is very up in the air now, but yeah, we're hoping to have some programming over the summer, so definitely just keep following our Instagram account at UCLA Teaching Kitchen. That is the best way to find out information about anything upcoming. I handle the Instagram account, and so if you need to message me, that's also a way to get in touch. It's a startling and happy sound when that goes off. Make sure that, give this a little peek. All right, we're looking now like it's a lot more dried out, close around the, another emergency alert. Okay, you see this now? Yes, that's good. Okay. It is very dry now, all the way up until here. I have just about a pancake size section right in this middle. That is, I don't know if you can even tell, a different color brown than the rest. Where it's cooked and dried out and starting to give me a little bit of crackle is a matte brown. In the middle, where it is still a little too raw for my liking, is a shiny brown. And we want the whole thing to be that kind of matte brown. But just, if we let it go too far after it has reached that peak matte brown color, then it starts to dry out in the middle. So these are the sort of tricky intricacies, it's a fun word, of this recipe: the sifting, the not overmixing, and knowing what you're looking for. And honestly, for me, there's no raw egg in this recipe. There's nothing that you could eat in this that is now at this point not cooked. The flour is cooked to a safe temperature. I don't know if you know that, but eating raw flour is not healthy. If you eat just regular raw flour, then that is not healthy for probably a few different reasons. But just raw flour in terms of raw batter or raw cookie dough or things that have large amounts of raw flour in them, it's not good for you to eat a lot of that. It can be not good for your stomach, your digestive system. So you do want to cook out your flour, but we have cooked that long enough now that there is no raw flour left. There's no raw cocoa powder. That's not how that works. So I would always prefer to cook this torte just under, than over. If you take it over, then it's going to be just a little bit dry, and I prefer a little bit of that sort of rich, fudgy consistency. And so just as if you are going to err on the side of caution, either undercooked or overcooked, there's nothing raw in this recipe. So a little undercooked is just fine. Because like I said, it's going to continue cooking, and sometimes more so than you think. And depending on how hot your kitchen is, it might cool down slower. There's all kinds of different things that come into effect there, or come into play. So yeah, for me, and maybe just a little note to think about going a little bit on the underside rather than on the overside. I know that when it has raw egg in it or certain things, then you want to make sure that it is cooked through. That's healthy, good for you. We don't have that issue here, which is great. So I just want to make sure that I get a little bit more of that matte color across the complete surface, right? Fill up that center area just a little bit more, which won't take very much longer. And then I'll be able to show you the release from the sides of the pan, and it's going to just finish cooling here a little bit. Let's see. Any other announcements or things? Oh, well, I can go back to that question. I'm sorry that you did just learn about that. I know a lot of people, we were trying to find ways of advertising through different avenues on campus. There's so many people to reach and so many different ways of doing so. But glad that you found us eventually, and definitely keep following so that you can hear about any updates towards our summer programming. When we do figure out what it's going to look like in the fall in terms of if we're having in-person classes, if we are just continuing to do virtual programming, whether that's from the kitchen on campus or continue to be from here, none of those things have technically been decided yet. So I don't really want to move anybody in the wrong direction towards that. But with all hope, I will at least be doing virtual teaching from the kitchen on campus so that we can start using the facility that was built for us, which is a great little kitchen. And then hopefully that would move into having small groups of students starting to join up again. But as you know, there's still a lot up in the air, and very little of that is entirely up to me. So we will be announcing things as quickly as we can figure them out and let you know. When we are back on campus, our mission as a teaching kitchen is to serve the community of the health professional students as well as the community of the UCLA student, staff, and faculty. So we have classes for nursing students and med school students, as well as classes for undergrad student groups, graduate school groups, people who take the food studies minor, Fiat Lux classes. There's staff and faculty groups that come in through the recreation department. And we are trying very hard to work our way up to the kinds of programming that is campus wide, where it's like, hey, the first 10 people who sign up for this class get to come learn lasagna on Friday night, or things like that. That was a totally random example, but we do want to eventually have those kinds of things. It's just everything is going to be very dependent on everything else for a little while. But our Instagram page and our website through Fitwell on the recreation site is definitely, those are the two best ways to see any updates or current or future programming that we're going to be doing. Okay, I have got a solid matte brown across the top all the way. I'm starting to get some good cracking around the sides here where it's been dried out the most. Got some good jiggle though in the middle. It still seems pretty wet down in the core, so I kind of want to give it a make sure. So I'm going to check with the toothpick. You want to go right in the middle because that's where it's going to be the least cooked, because it has the least contact with that surface. The sides of the pan are very hot. The middle has none of that contact to feed from. So I'm going to go in all the way to the bottom and back out. Okay, so this is very not done yet. This is wet batter, completely coated, still loose and wet, just like it was when it went in. Now, what's going to be, I'll show you on that same toothpick, on the side here, where it's been dried out and cracky for a good amount of time, comes out with just a little bit of that wet crumb. You see that little wet crumb? That's what we're going for in the middle. So we need to get this back into the oven because it's not done. Make sure I'm at the right temp. Yeah. My oven is so out of whack that 350 is basically, I have to turn it to 400. And I think I've said this before, but it's been a while, and I know people have come in new, which is awesome. You can get your oven calibrated. The gas company will come, and I'm pretty sure it's free. If not, it's a very small charge on your monthly bill, but I'm pretty sure it's free because they want your equipment to be using their product as efficiently as possible. And if your oven is not calibrated, then it's using gas incorrectly. So if you calibrate your oven or have a professional do it for you, then your gas will be used properly and it will be safer. And when you turn it to 350, it will actually be 350, which is very helpful when you do a lot of baking, especially. Sometimes cooking is like, it's okay, it might just take longer, or, well, no, if it's hot, then you're going to burn your food. It is important. It's nice to have a well-calibrated oven. And then, I know I mentioned this last week, I think, no, it couldn't have been in baking class because we didn't have that. If your oven door is open and let's say you just want to close it really quick, but your hands are full and you kind of give it a little kick. I know a lot of people who do that, or it accidentally slips out of your hand and slams shut. That happens. Try not to do that. The more forcefully you close your oven door, the more likely you are going to throw the thermometer system out of calibration. And so that little sensor inside your oven that picks up the temperature inside and tells itself, I am now at 350, and then it maintains 350, that can be thrown completely out of whack the more you slam the door of your oven. So try not to do that, and it'll make the stuff last longer and it'll just work better for you. Little tricks that I learned mostly from chefs who work in restaurants for a long time and have very old, dilapidated equipment, that if you just slam that door one more time, it might not work ever again. And so they are strict about how you treat their oven doors. I've had some people yell about slamming doors. That's fun. So don't work for crazy people and don't slam your oven door. I guess those are the two lessons from that little story. Can't always help the first part though, can we? Powdered sugar is ready for eventually when I am ready to garnish, although I think it's going to have to cool a while. If you haven't seen me do the demo of how to do the powdered sugar, you just put a small amount into a bowl sieve or a fine mesh strainer or a spoon. Sometimes if you have like one of these little, it's called a spider, it's for fry baskets or pasta, but it's very, very fine mesh. You could use that as well. But if you have a bowl sieve, that's the perfect option for this. And I'll show you on a plate what that is going to look like and why it's so pretty. I can check the chat. Can you please show the link? Yes. This is how we dust with powdered sugar. If you haven't seen this in the class before, you've got your little bowl sieve. You don't need much sugar. It goes a long way. I'm just going to do about a teaspoon. Put it in the bowl sieve. And then get it over your dessert or plate and just give it a little tap. Gentle, very gentle little tap. I've got a fan blowing in from the other room, so I have to kind of gauge the airspeed velocity here, but just giving it that gentle little tap is how you get that sort of bake shop dusting of powdered sugar that you see on very nice plate ups of cakes or tortes. In fact, a lot of restaurants will do that first. They'll dust the plate first, then plate your cake, then dust the cake. And it gives especially if you used a bitter sweet chocolate, which would have been fine. You could use a dark cocoa powder. Then the added sugar on the plate kind of helps balance out those different flavors if you used a bitter flavor. If you made a raspberry sauce, which I know it seems counterintuitive, there's so much sugar in the berries, they are sweet, but they are also very tart. And when you cook a raspberry sauce, it can kind of become very tart and a little bitter of an aftertaste too. So that sugar on the plate just helps bring it all together. Also, it just looks really pretty. So it's a nice way to treat yourself. Again, as you know, I like to say, we should all be treating ourselves. Let's see, can you share the links? Yeah, I'll type things into the chat box here. Really, on Instagram, we are just at UCLA Teaching Kitchen. And that's the easiest way to get in touch with me. And then our website, I will, I usually look on my phone. It is Fitwell/Teaching Kitchen, but I will send it out or type it into this by the end of the class. Yeah. It's at the recreation website, and it's Fitwell/Teaching Kitchen. But I will definitely type that in there. But that Instagram account, honestly, is the best way for you to stay in touch with any updates, and very specifically stay in touch with any updates that I have, because I'm the one that handles that. I don't handle the website. Amazing people do, but sometimes if you want something a little bit more direct, then just come to me at the Teaching Kitchen Instagram. Okay. Oh, this smells so good. Okay, I'm getting very, very little jiggle in the middle now, just a little bit, which is still nice because that's showing me it's not completely dried out. I'm gonna definitely check it again. We want to make sure, but I think that it's gonna come out pretty close to how I want it. I'm gonna try at this point to go into that little crack. That crack already exists, and so then I'm not ruining the look of my cake by adding a ton of holes to it. Yeah, okay. Just barely got a little bit of crumb on one side. Pretty clean toothpick. That's gonna finish cooking in the next few minutes, which means I'm done in the oven. I don't want it to go in there and dry out totally. I wanna let the carryover heat finish cooking it at this point, because I want it to be as moist as possible. What's really fun though is without eggs, just using baking soda and a little bit of vinegar, we've got a good nice rise on this cake. It's a good airy cake. Now I said though at the beginning, it's gonna sink a little bit. There's nothing there to hold it. There's no gluten really to stiffen this up like a normal flour would. So it will rise, sink a little bit. Don't think that you did anything wrong. When you see the final picture that I post on our Instagram account, which I do after every class to give you a better close-up view of the final product, you will see that mine will have fallen by the time it's cooled down. Mine will have fallen, especially a little bit in the middle where it doesn't have the sides that held it up, you know? So don't think you did anything wrong. That's very natural. It doesn't have the structure that normal baking flour does. So it just doesn't hold itself up the same way. If you had made a flourless cake but with eggs, you could make a gluten-free but not vegan cake. Then the eggs would create a little bit more stability, but you would still have a bit of a sink. It's the flour that creates that stability. So we don't have that in this recipe, obviously. So it is going to fall just a hair. Don't worry about it. It's going to be delicious. The whole point of this is the taste, and again, the rustic appeal. Okay. So we're right here at the end. If there are any last questions, go ahead and shoot them at me now. Otherwise, definitely check the account. I would say I need about 15 minutes for this to be cooled down, and then I'll post a picture. Now the pan is kind of hot, but I do want to show you this if you have a minute. The fun about the springform pan is I can, it has this clasp on one side that I can just open it, and it releases the pan from the sides and makes it much easier to serve and much easier to now to let the whole process cool. And then scooping it out of the dish is going to be easier because I don't have a side to deal with. So that's the beauty of a spring form, especially when you're dealing with something that doesn't have its own stability when baking. And then you can remove the stability, and look, there you have a beautiful torte. So check out for the final picture on Instagram. And if you think of a question or have an issue that comes up after the class, then don't hesitate to send me a message or send me an email. You all have my email address from the reminders I've been sending. And definitely sign up for those other classes this week. We have some fun stuff coming up in our last couple of weeks. Oh, and we had to postpone last week's dorm cooking class because of a neighborhood-wide internet outage, and so we will have a dorm microwave-friendly cooking class this Friday also. So tell any students that you might have access to that that might help them if it might help anybody. So thank you for being here as usual. This was fun. I hope that everybody is safe and healthy, and yeah, so I'm gonna stop recording.